November 2025 marks 200 years since the founding of Choctaw Academy, the first boarding school for Native Americans in the United States. Located in Great Crossings in Scott County, Choctaw Academy educated more than 600 students from across 17 nations. The academy, however, was more than a boarding school. It was a place where larger debates over imperialism, slavery, and Native American policy played out. Join us today for a discussion with Dr. Christina Snyder, author of the 2017 book Great Crossings: Indians, Settlers, and Slaves in the Age of Jackson, as we explore the pages of Kentucky history with Kentucky Chronicles. I'm Alan Fletcher, the host of Kentucky Chronicles, a podcast of the Kentucky Historical Society. I'm the associate editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, a scholarly journal and publication since 1903. I also coordinate our Research Fellows program. Kentucky Chronicles is a podcast that shares diverse histories from the Commonwealth and beyond. It is inspired by the works of researchers from across the world who have explored our rich archival holdings at the Kentucky Historical Society. Today's guest is Dr. Christina Snyder. She is the McCabe-Greer Professor of History at the Pennsylvania State University. She earned her Ph.D. in History from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Snyder is the author of Great Crossings: Indians, Settlers, and Slaves in the Age of Jackson, and Slavery in Indian Country: The Changing Face of Captivity in Early America. These books received a wide range of accolades, including the Francis Parkman Prize, the John H. Dunning Prize, the James H. Broussard Prize, and the John C. Ewers Prize. Her research has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, the National Humanities Center, and the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. Dr. Snyder, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
This book was published in 2017, and this November will mark 200 years since the founding of the Choctaw Academy in Great Crossings in Scott County here in Kentucky. So can you give us just a little background on how and why an academy like this got started?
So this academy was seen as an experiment at the time that it was founded. And the two groups who were really responsible for the founding was the federal government on one side and Native nations, and especially the Choctaw Nation on the other side. And I would say that they had different motivations. So I'll kind of go through each of those. The federal government, for its part, was creating Choctaw Academy as part of its broader U.S. Indian policy at the time, which was called civilization policy. And the idea was to basically remake Indigenous people in the image of white Anglo-Americans. So it was an attempt to change Indigenous cultures, languages, economies, with the idea that eventually they would blend into the broader United States and cede their land. So really the ultimate goal is to gain Indigenous land with the idea of assimilation. On the part of the Native people, they had very different ideas. None of them were interested in ceding land or becoming part of the United States, but they were interested in education. And to understand this, we have to understand the challenges that Native nations were facing at the time, particularly Native nations who were living east of the Mississippi, like the Choctaws. There was already pressure, even before Andrew Jackson was elected, for Native peoples to go west of the Mississippi. Native people were thinking about ways to live together with white Americans, to live alongside of the United States without becoming part of the United States. And part of how they hoped to do that was through trade, economic relations, diplomatic relations. And to do that, they felt they needed proficient English speakers. They had in the past often relied on interpreters, often traders who might have mixed motivations. And they really wanted a class of people who could, for example, read treaties, the language of legalese, which is hard for anyone to read, even native English speakers. So they wanted people who were very proficient in English and in kind of American ways. So that was really their interest in education. The only opportunity that Native people really had for American-style schooling in their own nations was through missionaries. Christian conversion at the time was more controversial than English literacy. So Choctaw Academy was founded and operated by Richard Mentor Johnson. And part of what he advertised to Native peoples was English language education without the missionary aspect of it. So it was supposed to be a more secular alternative to mission schooling. And it was also supposed to be a more elite kind of education than what was offered at the mission schools. So another thing that Richard Mentor Johnson used to advertise the school was the idea that graduates from Choctaw Academy might go on to enroll in Transylvania University, for example, which some of them actually did, to go on to more advanced training in law and medicine. In brief, Native people in the federal government had different ultimate goals, although they could agree on education as something that many of leaders in both of those contexts shared.
And we can get to Richard Mentor Johnson in just a minute. And you describe Choctaw as a kind of study abroad experiment for Choctaw people. So they're coming up to Great Crossings. Can you give us a sense of everyday life at the school? What kind of curriculum was being offered? You mentioned English speaking, but what other kinds of curriculum could one expect there?
So there were essentially three different levels of education at Choctaw Academy. There was beginning subjects for people who were new to American education, and those would be things like spelling, arithmetic, basic literacy. The interesting thing about academies at the time, not just academies for American Indians, but academies for all Americans, was that they were open to all ages of learners. So whether one was an 8-year-old boy or a 25-year-old man, if they didn't have English literacy already, they would end up in this earliest class. So that would be something that might strike us today as being really strange to see people of really different age groups in the same class. But it was, again, really based on proficiency with English. So that was the basic. And then intermediary would be subjects like more advanced literacy, elocution, which is the art of good speaking, more advanced kinds of math, geography. And then at the most elite level, which most people never actually reach the most elite level, but for people who are interested in going on to colleges or universities or medical school, there was an expectation at the time that those people would know Greek and Latin. So the top learners would sometimes get education in Greek or Latin, as well as training in philosophy, political science, those kinds of subjects. So really broad curriculum at the time that was geared toward different levels of learners.
And all of this is taking place in the community of Great Crossings, which you really use as a sort of microcosm for thinking about not only questions of education, but of race and class during the early 19th century. And you mentioned Richard Mentor Johnson, who ran Choctaw Academy. He was there with his wife, Julia Chin, in quotes. In fact, we had Amrita Myers on the podcast a season ago who talked about her book, The Vice President's Black Wife. But all of this to say that Great Crossings was a place that was a world that valued whiteness and patriarchy. But you're making the case that a lot of racial and class lines are being blurred during this time. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Sure. I think both of those things are true. I think it is a place that prizes whiteness and patriarchy, and at the same time, there are forces pushing against that. So the first thing I want to remind everyone of is that in the 1820s, Kentucky is the West. And it is the West looms large in the American imagination as a place of opportunity, a place to remake oneself. And Kentucky, and particularly Kentuckians like Richard Mentor Johnson, really wanted to embrace this progressive vision of what Kentucky could be. He thought of it as a place that was more fluid than a place like Virginia, a place with less strict class divides, more informal place, but also a place where people could progress through learning. And so he championed all kinds of educational institutions, including Choctaw Academy. What I've talked about here is, the vision of the most elite white men. And Richard Mentor Johnson was in many ways, like he was a popular Jacksonian Democrat. He was elected continually by the people of Kentucky as either a congressman or a senator. But he was also atypical in some ways. So you referenced Julia Chin, who was a Black woman who had been enslaved by his parents, and his father transferred ownership of Julia to Richard Mentor Johnson when he moved out of the household. And as far as we can tell, Julia Chin was never emancipated. She did become Richard Mentor Johnson's longtime partner in many ways, including sexual partner. We don't know all the details of that relationship. Julia Chen was actually literate and wrote Mentor Johnson letters when he was in DC, but it seems that later his family destroyed most of that correspondence. So we don't have many sources from Chen herself. We know more about Richard Mentor Johnson's relationship with his two mixed race daughters, Imogene and Adeline, who he emancipated and provided property for. And so, there's a sense in which Richard Mentor Johnson and Julia Chen wanted different things for their children. Their children are people of color. They are people who are traditionally disenfranchised in American society as both women and people of color. For part of their lives, they're also enslaved people. And Johnson really sees Choctaw Academy as an opportunity to educate his children as well, and to do it covertly. Kentucky was one of the few Southern states that did not outlaw education for Black Americans in the antebellum period, but it was certainly frowned upon. It was very controversial still. And what Richard Mentor Johnson did, which he wrote about in his letters at the Filson, you can see these letters, is that he skimmed money off the top of what the Choctaw Nation was paying him to pay the headmaster of Choctaw Academy at night and on the weekends to teach his daughters and also some of their cousins, things like literacy, mathematics, bookkeeping, which were things that you can see his daughters using later in life. We even have like really interesting evidence for the broader community of Great Crossings. So enslaved people at Great Crossings they're also interested in accessing education, and they do it covertly. So there are oral history accounts and some written accounts of people sneaking away from plantations at night to go read books in the woods and to go teach one another to read books. One of the facets of enslaved life in antebellum Kentucky is that some of these people worked at hemp factories, and they often spent the night at these factories. So that was a place where male slaves could also have a kind of autonomous time at night. And we know that literacy is part of what they were doing in secret. So, at the same time that Kentucky was a society that was certainly prized patriarchy, whiteness, masculinity, there were forces that were pulling against that, both from inside the most elite members of society at times, but also people who had been disenfranchised and were looking for better opportunities.
You mentioned these forces that are pulling at this more egalitarian vision. I'm not sure if egalitarian is the right word, but a more radical experimental community that was happening at Great Crossings. And one of those forces is Indian removal, which will take place pretty soon after Choctaw Academy is founded in 1825. Andrew Jackson will be elected in 1828. So can you talk a little bit about how Indian removal policies are affecting life at the Academy and in Great Crossings?
Yes, so this is really the pivotal moment in the book. It represents a really different vision of what relationships should be like between Indigenous nations and the federal government. So whereas under the civilization policy, there had been an idea of peaceful interaction and assimilation, removal sought land, but it sought to do it in a forcible way that separated Native people from the fabric of US society, far away west of the Mississippi. So, I think listeners might be most familiar with Cherokee removal and the Trail of Tears, but under Andrew Jackson's vision, removal was a policy that should affect all indigenous nations of the East and forced them west of the Mississippi. So in total, it forced about 80,000 indigenous people west of the Mississippi, including, I mean, all of the nations, all of the 17 different nations represented at Choctaw Academy experienced removal in one way or another. Both indigenous people and the whites who were involved in Choctaw Academy questioned what this meant for the future of the academy. Some people said, some people, especially in government, said, what's the utility of indigenous education if the goal is separation and isolation? Are indigenous people, this is also an era of increasing racism, and it's part of the development of what we now call scientific racism, which is the use of phrenology, measuring people's head shapes and sizes to rank the races. So some people, white people, and especially members of the Jackson administration had started to promote this idea that whites were inherently biologically superior to other races. And so there should not be race mixing, for example, or integration of non-white people into the American Republic. There's this real debate of whether the academy should continue at all. For Native people themselves, this is a time of tremendous upheaval. Most of the nations that are involved in this process experience mortality rates of 10 to 25%. So the way in which removal is conducted is extremely violent and full of deprivation that's caused by starvation and exposure and illness. Students who are at this academy are experiencing their relatives moving away, fear of the future of their nations, and there are debates among families about whether it is safer to leave their children at Choctaw Academy, which is in a relatively stable part of the United States, or to take the children with them on the Trail of Tears where they might face greater danger. And ultimately, most families elect to leave their children at the academy, again, partially because they believe it will be safer for the children. It does lead to the introduction of new curricula at the academy. So part of the argument that Richard Mentor Johnson makes to the federal government is that he'll provide Native students there with trade skills. And these are the kinds of skills that white Americans who promoted ideas of scientific racism believe that people of color should take on in the new nation. So these would be skills that relied less on higher education and more on manual labor. And this became a constant source of conflict between officials at the school and Native nations who overwhelmingly did not want their children to be learning these skills. First of all, because the academy was really expensive. It was about the same cost, for example, as attending the University of North Carolina or the University of Virginia at the time. And also because it's not what they envisioned for their children. They wanted their children to go to this school and become community leaders, doctors, lawyers, those kinds of professions. So this is basically the beginning of the end of Choctaw Academy. This would lead to, a decade and a half of argument about what the nature of education should be with regard to Indigenous children.
So as we're seeing all of these changes in the 1830s and 40s regarding Indian removal policies, changes in slavery, changes in thinking about racial ideology, as you mentioned. Not to mention Richard M. Johnson seemed to be in debt more often than not. So what did all of this mean in the final years of Choctaw Academy? What happened essentially?
Yeah, so the academy it falls apart in 1848. And there are a couple of different factors. I should say, first off, Richard Mentor Johnson, he's interested in Choctaw Academy for several reasons, including enhancing his political career, educating his children, but also making money. And he is always seeking to make money off this school. He's perpetually in debt. He had many bad investments over the course of his career. And so he's always skimming off the top of the academy. And over time, tribal officials who periodically visit the school become aware of this. And some of the students will also write home about issues that they see of like corruption or people not being given the food or clothing that they feel is appropriate. So the financial mismanagement is a big part of this. And again, this is an expensive school, and the way that these tribal nations are paying for it is through annuities, which are monies given by the federal government in exchange for land. So this is like the whales of their native land. This is like their most, tribal nations talk about this as their most precious resource at the time. And they want to invest that money in a way that's going to benefit their children and future generations. They're not giving it to white politicians to get rich. So the money is a big part of it. And the other part of it is this broader existential question of like, what is the place of non-whites in the United States? Like, can they get a fair shake? Can they get a good education? And ultimately, what Native nations decide is that no, that's not possible in the aftermath of Indian removal. So in the 1840s, what happens is that, and I should say that Native nations are able to do this because they're the ones financing the school overwhelmingly. There's only a small percentage of money that comes from the federal government. Most of it is from Native nations. And so they start to end their contracts with the academy, and they take that money and reinvest it in their own school systems, which are within their tribal nations in what's called Indian Territory, which is the place that they've been deported to. I think that there are broader lessons here about education. Some Native nations, I should say, from the outset are very suspicious of American style education and are not interested in it, period. But for those who are, they want to gain access to education. They want to be able to engage with the United States, but they want to do it on their own terms. And they want to learn the kinds of skills that will sustain their nations. Like education is ultimately about thinking about the future and investing in the future. And so Native nations had a very different vision of what their future was than the United States did.
And I think you make a great point that despite these inward and outward pressures on Native Americans, this isn't a story of absolute power or domination, that despite being deported to Indian Territory, that the Choctaws and other nations are able to still use education to empower themselves and to still push back against these forces of settler colonialism.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big takeaways of the book. If you look at Native American history and the books that are written about Native American history, there are so many books that end with removal as though that's the end of the story, which is not the intention of the authors, I'm sure. But in terms of periodization, it's often where these books end. And so this was a book that I purposely wanted to bridge that era and show that these nations, while they're very often devastated financially, demographically, by removal, they survive. And I think the tenacity of those nations is what really the incredible part of this story. And they do use education to fight back. So Native people continue to get high quality education in Indian Territory. And I would say it's all of these nations that are involved in Choctaw Academy develop their own school systems. And the Cherokee and Choctaw Nation in particular have very high rates of literacy, over 90% in the late 19th century, which is even higher than the United States. They pour a lot of their national treasury into their school systems. And they have graduates who go to college or medical school or law school in the United States. And these are largely the people who are interlocutors between Native nations in the United States, as lawyers, interpreters, treaty negotiators. And they're continually fighting for the autonomy of their own nations, despite the growing power of the United States.
And I think that segues pretty well into my last question, which is also thinking more broadly about your book. And one of your larger arguments is that Choctaw Academy and Great Crossings is really useful for rethinking the Jacksonian era, which is normally Eurocentric, which is normally this narrative of expansion from east to west, but looking at Native Americans like the Choctaws, looking at a place like Kentucky can allow us to start inward and then expand outward. So since this is a Kentucky history podcast, do you have any final thoughts about why studying Kentucky can be so useful for thinking about this period?
Sure. Yeah. I think one of the things that attracted me about this book was, instead of moving from east to west, that I would start in the middle and look outward, which I think in many ways allows us to capture the dynamism of that period. I mean, this is a time of tremendous change in terms of technology. There are steamboats, railroads, rapid territorial change. And Kentucky's in the middle of all of that. And I think that, when we look, we can see different perspectives on Kentucky. So in the minds of white Americans, Kentucky is a place of opportunity like the rest of the West. It's a place where Americans can maybe remake themselves in a more democratic way, in a more inclusive or fair way. People interpret it in different ways. Some African Americans see the West as a place of opportunity and potential freedom. For Native people, they see Kentucky as a space that's closer to their homelands than the East Coast, and a place where they can immerse themselves in learning English and learning the skills that they need to go back home. So I think the idea of, Kentucky as a crossroads is a really valuable one. I think it gets to some of the most important ideas in early American history today, which is that North America is a place of multiple sovereignties. There's Britain and the United States. Kentucky was once on the edge of Spanish jurisdiction, right? Kentucky is close to a lot of indigenous nations. It's a place where people are traveling the Ohio and the Mississippi and coming together in this place. I think that idea about Kentucky as a place of crossroads and intersections is a great way to see a window into conflict between early Americans about what America was and what it should be.
I think those are some great closing thoughts. Professor Snyder, thank you so much for joining me.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me.
Choctaw Academy left a complicated legacy. In its early years, it was a place that represented the promise of early America, an America built on access to education, Republican values, and a vision of eventual emancipation. Yet by the time the Academy closed its doors in 1848, America was a different place. The expansion of slavery, paired with years of Native American removal, made it more difficult to realize Choctaw's original vision of interracial collaboration. As Professor Snyder showed, looking to Great Crossings helps us understand and rethink the history of the Jacksonian era. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society, with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Our show is produced by Gregory Hardison, with support from Dr. Stephanie Lang. Our theme music is used courtesy of Pixabay. To learn more about our publication of The Register or our Research Fellows program, please visit our website, history.ky.gov. If you have enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe. You can also help us build a following by telling your friends and colleagues. Thanks to Professor Snyder for appearing on today's episode, and I look forward to welcoming our next guest on Kentucky Chronicles.